Hey, welcome to the CineFiles. Breakfast time on Sunday out on Staten Island. And yes, I am back, Michael Foltz, ready to go. It feels comfy now. It feels like I'm at home again in these great surroundings after, Jesus Christ, what, about 2 years now?
Almost.
Shit. Anyway, once again, let me introduce my cohorts in crime. We've got Mr. Andre Joseph and Mr. Jeff Galashaw. Oh, that's the worst. Don't do that again. I like that better, actually. Today's discussion is, I think, very prescient and very timely right now. It's political films, because we're in the midst of a 2016 election cycle here for a race for the presidency between Hillary Clinton and Lex Luthor. And
With hair,
yeah,
supposedly.
And that's a political debate in and of itself. And we just want to talk about not necessarily political films that have come out recently, but how political films have evolved or stayed the same over the years. And, if political films have influenced politics, if they have not influenced politics, if they've influenced people's thinking on how to vote, if they haven't, one thing that I can think of, I think the reason why we're discussing this too is because one of the people running for president, Donald Trump, had his own TV show. How many presidential candidates can we say that about? Probably not since Ronald Reagan, who was a grade C rated actor throughout Hollywood. Who was a governor. That's exactly right. He was a governor of California. But he was a half-rate actor. He caught a moment. People liked the way he spoke on the right. And Donald Trump comes and grabs a moment in history where he feels like he's going to be the guy to lead this country. God help us. But how would you see as films being able to, I guess political films should be treated like a time capsule in a way that you can look back at a particular film and know exactly what's going on in that era. Like, let's say All the President's Men.
Okay.
I think that's a great example of capturing what was going on in the time of the country in terms of the paranoia, the underhandedness of how the presidency was being misused. Well, in the Nixon era, that is.
Well, it also is, like you said, a great time capsule, because it was also when you could take a national story that was going on and actually put it towards the big screen with actual talent behind it, rather than, let's say, these days or maybe back when I was growing up, where it would be like, oh, this great sensational story, great TV movie. And now...
But you mean back then or now?
I would say more when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. But see, I
see what you're saying.
Yeah, but at least like in the 70s, you would get a sensational story and it would capture the nation's interest, and you could still get like the A-list stars, good directors, great writers behind it to actually explain everything that went down and basically dramatize it and still make it entertaining. Instead of just All the President's Men, obviously based on mostly facts. And, some of it, takes professional leisure to make an entertaining story. But now what you would probably get is somebody...
Entertaining license, not entertaining leisure.
Thank you for saying that on camera. But yes. Yes.
I was just wondering where we were going with that. But anyway, go on.
Okay, but it seems like today you probably get something cleverly written around that scandal, but they could change it enough so that the facts could be more sensational and entertaining for their own right.
Don't you think that that's what movies are all about? You cannot put really the cold facts down, paint by number, so to speak, and not add some more entertaining elements inside there to make a compelling film?
You have to, or else it would pretty much just be a documentary.
Documentary, yeah.
And you'd have to think of different ways to jazz it up as a documentary to make it more appealing, so that it's not just all talking heads, because sometimes that's like the death of a documentary, whereas you can have a great subject, but if it's just all talking heads, you'll just be like...
or piece together with the photos of the time.
Exactly. So, but my thing is, obviously, All the President's Men is one of the biggies, but then, you have things like the parallax view, which kind of uses politics and a conspiracy around what a central story is supposed to be.
Or actually, 70s was the time of the conspiracy.
Yes.
Because I think Nixon, the Nixon presidency and what he did shook the country to its core on that the president could be so underhanded, that he could be so devious, that he could record his enemies, he could break into the DNC and find out what their polling secrets and polling data was and work that against him. I mean, after all, George McGovern lost in a landslide in 1972, and a lot of people point to what the break-in by G. Gordon Liddy and his other accomplices did.
But see, I feel like when that happened, okay, before everything was like pro-country, pro-America, but after that scandal broke, basically what all the youth at that time, or what they felt, finally came into light, that the government, well, as great as it is, you can't be trusted.
I don't think it was that pro-America. I think the last really patriotic pro-America time was, I think, at the height of the Cold War in the 50s and early portion of the 60s. But don't you think around, let's say, 1966, 67, when the counterculture started to get its grips into things?
Well, that's when they started questioning, but I feel like Richard Nixon exposed like everything they ever thought.
So for the counterculture and the baby boom generation, for them to go, aha, we weren't being paranoid.
Exactly.
It really is. We really should be distrustful of our government.
Yeah, and I think All the President's Men certainly was that film that, I'd say, like, before that, a lot of it was just based on simply conspiracy theories and just trying to add to it in films like The Parallax View. But that was the movie where, because it was a true story, it was because of these journalists who find out about...
Woodward and Bernstein.
Yeah, Carl, like, finding out what they uncovered with the Watergate scandal and just their interactions with the characters in that film, all their sources, the deep throat and all that, it just showed, like, how scary this thing really was, that nobody really wanted to talk or else their lives are going to be ruined. And to show that on screen only reinforced that idea that you could not trust what, like, a war that was going on at that time, to say, well, if you don't like this war, you don't like the government. Well, now this is a movie that showed there was a reason not to like your government.
It's also interesting, too, that you had to wait at least a decade later to criticize the Vietnam War.
Right.
Because there was no movies in the 70s that were actively, pointedly criticizing the Vietnam War.
Absolutely, yeah.
You could criticize the politicians, but you could not criticize the war itself until the mid-'80s when Platoon comes out in Full Metal Jacket and Hamburger Hill. And, Another thing that I'm thinking of as we're doing this subject, I think it's very interesting, too, that there were not, and still are not, a lot of films that came out about Reagan and the Reagan years during that time.
Oh, during the time now.
Why do you think? I mean, why is that? There was no films with the Iran-Contra. There was no films with Ollie North. There was no films with, if anything, you get these minor films like with, what's his name, Larry from The Normal Heart.
Oh, Larry
Kramer. Larry Kramer goes into the fact that the government at the time was ignoring the AIDS crisis. But that's about it. Was it because... I don't know. What was it? Why is it that we don't look back on the Reagan era and see that many movies about the Reagan era?
Maybe because so many people lived through it that only now that they're really starting to write books about how the hierarchy and how it kind of infiltrated everything. Because really the only thing you kind of get more is now everybody's focused on the Middle East. So you get more films like Charlie Wilson's War, which is more minor and more,
also a Reagan era film.
Yeah, but it seems.
But outside of the country, though, really.
Yeah, but it really doesn't talk about what Reagan did or what effects it had on American soil. So
too many films set in the '80s tend to focus on the '70s, that was the turbulent time. By the '80s, everything kind of turned around because of the yuppie movement. Because
Morning in America.
Right.
And it seems like more films are trying to get the look and the feel of the times, but they're not really interested in the politics or the mood of the time.
And when they do, it's something like the HBO movie The Day Reagan Got Shot with Richard Dreyfuss, where he's the Speaker of the House and he takes over, he tries to take over the White House after Reagan got shot by Hinckley.
Oh, yes, where he was where he messed up the chain of command.
Yeah, the whole
It's
24-hour period of all the madness going on because they thought he was going to just die right there.
I had never seen that film.
It's like ages ago.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I've heard of it, but I've never seen it.
But then you turn around and you look at the 90s, and films about the Clinton era were made almost immediately.
Well,
and the two that I
Primary
come to
Colors.
example is the documentary The War Room, which was in the process of electing Clinton as the president, and what the behind the scenes. That was a very prominent documentary for probably for the 90s. And then a couple years later, you had Primary Colors.
Yeah,
In the midst of the presidency,
the
you never see that.
Romaniclef.
You never see that.
Supposedly.
But isn't that something though, that you see something like that, or even before that, you get Dave as like, and I saw Dave as Hollywood's answer to what a president should look like because of how badly George Bush Sr. was doing. And I think I think Dave was the statement that, or the American president, I think Dave and the American president are very close. And I think they both could sit there and say, you know, this is how a president should be in our eyes, and watch this movie, enjoy it, and know that we're right.
Well,
even though American president was during the Clinton time.
Well, do you think it's mainly because it seems like when it comes to Democrats, maybe people with money are more quick to fund movies to kind of criticize them, at least as far as Primary Colors, which did not paint, obviously, Clinton in the best of lights, whereas The War Room was really more about the struggle and uplift of, a candidate you could believe in. So they're kind of like versus each other. War Room's more of a positive look at Clinton, whereas Primary Colors is more of a negative.
Which is odd because Primary Colors was written by Joe Klein, who is a fairly liberal journalist.
I mean, it didn't. Well, have you read the book?
I never read it.
No, I never read the book either.
Okay. But I mean, well, the book is a lot harsher. But in the film, I mean, he's a womanizer. He pays one of his old friends whose underage daughter he gets pregnant to have an abortion, and basically, Adrian Lester's character becomes disillusioned, but he's still better than the person he's running against. So it's like, and what I mainly remember about Primary Colors was how good Larry Hagman was in the movie.
What was his role? I don't remember.
He was the other Democratic the guy who was running against him in the Democratic race. But then they dig up all this story about how he used to be a drug addict and sex parties. And basically they use it as leverage. And the black guy, Adrian Lester, doesn't want to use it. But of course, Billy Bob Thornton and Kathy Bates,
like the one investigator.
Yeah, and she really doesn't want to use it, and because of this whole big argument, spoiler, she ends up killing herself. So it's like, well, I'm sorry. To me, that's a bad character assessment of Clinton in that movie.
I think, honestly, even though Mike Nichols was in charge of that film, I think it was a mistake to put something like that on so soon, because I think that Travolta and Emma Thompson come off very cartoonish throughout the whole thing.
Well, definitely Travolta.
Yeah, the accent, the hair, even like his speeches, the way he tried to impersonate.
Well, it seems more like a thing of stunt casting almost. Like, hey, watch John Travolta do this Arkansas accent.
And you know that and he was the hot ticket at the time. He wasn't that far off from Pulp Fiction. And Travolta was getting all the A roles coming his way, and this was just one of them. And I remember that Clinton phoned Travolta and said, please take it easy on me in this film. I know the book, so please take it easy on me. And Travolta goes, well, tell you what, I'll take it easy on you if you have some sort of influence with the country of Germany in persecuting Scientologists. I look back and thinking, Jesus Christ. I hope Clinton didn't have any influence on Germany, because Scientologists needs to be persecuted as much as possible. But I just find that very interesting that the films in the Clinton era came out during his presidency and were right there, but yet with Reagan we saw nothing. Same with Nixon. The movies were there at the forefront. Now, granted, nothing came out saying, there was no movies that came out like Nixon is a jackass or anything like that. And matter of fact, we don't get Frost Nixon until like 3 decades, after. And we end up getting a documentary almost at the same time, too, discussing the very famous interview between Martin Frost, who is a famed British television journalist, who sat down with Richard Nixon years after Watergate, and years after he had left the presidency, to talk about what happened with that, and the interview that we get to see during the documentary, and then, of course, played through the fictional film that Ron Howard did,
Right.
was talking about how Nixon felt as president he was entitled to do whatever the hell he felt like doing. And I feel that the documentary it's interesting, but it's very dry. And I think in Ron Howard's mind, he could take Frank Langella and Michael Sheen and really amp up the drama. And it to me, it felt kind of like a clown show. It didn't have the gravitas of what happened with the original film,
Okay.
or the documentary, or the original event. I don't know. What did you guys think of Frost Nixon?
It felt like too much of a build-up, like a focus on Frost in terms of, like, he's just this big hotshot celebrity, just with this big opportunity to make it big in America, and you see him kind of being a little bit of a womanizer, party animal type, so he's not as focused in those first two interviews when he's throwing all these hard questions at Nixon, and Nixon's just throwing, like, the softball answers that make him look great, and it's not until he gets serious and does his homework that he suddenly now, that third act, he becomes like this deadly, on point, take accountability for what happened in Vietnam and Watergate. It felt very commercialized, even though I thought the acting
I
was
agree.
fantastic.
I
But
agree.
Yeah, I mean, for Ron Howard, who I think is a fantastic director.
I disagree with that, but anyway. I find him to be too commercial. There's no interest in a political film that has yet to... you can grab somebody with episodic TV, but you can't grab them with a film anymore. And if you are going to grab them with a film in the last 10 years, let's be honest, it's going to be a documentary. If you think about the most successful political film probably within the last 15 to 20 years was Fahrenheit 9/11.
Well, I think also because people...
And it raked in hundreds of millions of dollars, and it still didn't affect the political race. And that's mind-boggling, that you can have a blockbuster film and it cannot sway an election.
Because there were people that were still influenced by... you had West Coast, East Coast audiences and just the public that was against the war. They knew we were lied to about the WMDs, and they see this film and reinforce that fact. But you still had those red states that still believe we're doing the right thing, we're fighting terrorism. Most of their children were out fighting the war, and they believed in it. And they didn't see that turnaround until, like, maybe after Katrina, or maybe after, the housing crisis. So it took a while for them to really realize how messed up the Bush administration was, and then it was too late. Then you get a movie like W come out, and that went nowhere at the box office because clearly
Because it was like a collective shrug from Americans. Was like, we knew he was a boob, and we're trying to forget that time as much as possible.
Well, it also seemed like that was more like everybody, let's do our best impersonation of this political figure.
Right.
From an all-star cast.
Kind of like Primary Colors. It was a rush job.
Yes, but I think also with...
Although I think W was a much better film than Primary Colors. Much more enjoyable.
Josh Brolin was excellent.
I like Primary Colors more.
To see Josh Brolin's W versus Travolta's Clinton, I thought was
no,
worlds
very.
apart.
Well, I also think that because we're so inundated with politics in real life, it's harder to come
And the
up
24-hour news cycle, sure.
it's harder to come up with a fictional story where audiences are going to pay to want to see this. Like, what if the president did this? What if the president did that? Or what if a politician did this? When every day we're confronted with a new story about what a politician did do or didn't do.
Well, especially now that you point that out with the 24-hour news cycle and with CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, how many times are you going to hear somebody that you talk to in passing who say something like, well, why would I go see that at the movie? All I have to do is turn on the news and watch that.
Exactly, and spend money to go see it too.
Yeah. I mean, granted, there's a huge segment of the population that does not want to see a frat boy comedy. They do not want to see a superhero movie. There's many adults out there that say, let's see a movie for adults. But still, movie studios know that they're not a very, they're not a ticket driving force like the other ones that they're going to.
Well,
Right. I mean, I know as a New Yorker myself, and you talk about regular local city politics, I don't see a whole audience want to go see a movie like Wiener. You know, focusing on
Just for the name.
the great congressman who flashed his thing on Twitter and got in trouble for it, got kicked out of office, tried to run for mayor, but then found out there was more of a scandal going on. But a very fascinating documentary because it goes beyond the headlines, goes beyond, just the news cycles trying to focus on the heinous acts that he was doing, or not the fact that he was suddenly trying to be like Peter Finch and Network, just totally losing it on people like Lawrence O'Donnell, but really showing here was a guy that really wanted to get back into politics, who was trying to get his act together, but as crazier as he gets, you look at his wife, who was part of Hillary Clinton's administration,
Who still is.
and still is, and you just see her cringing at every moment that he humiliates himself on camera or tries to be so forward about his agenda and trying to redeem his image, and it's just not helping. You can just see she just doesn't want to be there.
That brings me to what, Jeff, you said earlier. That's a character study.
Yeah.
The only thing is he's a real-life person. He's not a character.
Right.
He's not somebody that Arthur Miller wrote on a play back in 1956. This is a guy that has serious delusions. And but this is also, once again, it kind of goes back to primary colors. And you could even, and I'm sure there's some conservative people out there that say you could draw it to All the President's Men as well. We hold our politicians in some sort of regard where they have to be these flawless automatons instead of the human beings that they are in real life, like we are. So, yeah, sure, Clinton had his faults. Was he an effective leader? Yes. Wiener had his problems, hubris being one of them. But was he an effective congressman? Hell yeah, he was. And I point to another documentary where this documentary breaks my heart, which is Client 9. I was a big believer in Eliot Spitzer. He was going to be a fantastic governor, a possible presidential candidate.
Sheriff of Wall Street.
Yeah, the Sheriff of Wall Street. That's great. Yeah, that's exactly right. He was, the state attorney general. He really went after a lot of corporate crooks. The New York Post hated him, so automatically I liked him. And but then you watch this, and he is more than willing to come out and say it was a certain level of hubris that allowed me to do this, that allowed me to go to prostitutes and have this portion of my ego satisfied despite all my winnings, despite all my victories, despite all that I accomplished. I still needed this for some sort of complicated inner reason. And then you see these scumbags like Roger Stone, and you see, what's his name from Home Depot, Kenneth, the billionaire that was responsible for creating Home Depot, and Kenneth, I can see his face now, and he's the one that was paying people to tail Eliot Spitzer, Ken Langone. Because we have Langone Medical Center in Manhattan. So they think, oh, anybody that creates a hospital can't be bad. Well, look at the Koch brothers. They donate to Lincoln Center Ballet all the time. And you see the Koch, they have a hospital in Manhattan too. So because they're giving us hospitals means they can take our politicians who are trying to do everybody good and, slam them down.
Well, in my opinion, because I think it was hyped up well and it had a good concept, but the execution was terrible, was Man of the Year with Robin Williams. Now, here's a movie where they were cashing in on the success of The Daily Show by having him play this Jon Stewart type of political commentator, comedian, who gets convinced to run for president and actually wins. The advertisements make you think it's supposed to be like the candidate. He goes into office and it's like, okay, now what's he going to do? But instead, the movie gets into this whole thing with the voter machines were rigged by a corporation, and there was this random algorithm that causes Williams' character to get elected. Then you have this whole conspiracy plot with Laura Linney getting fired from the corporation. They're trying to make her look like a kook. And then she has a relationship with Robin Williams while these guys are trying to kill her. And it's supposed to be a comedy, So it's like the tone that Barry Levinson was trying to go for. If there was a message to this movie, it was all over the place. And yet this could have been an amazing concept of a comedian becoming a politician, which is kind of what's happening right now.
We have not seen a good Barry Levinson film in a long, long time.
Not since Wag the Dog.
If anybody, also another Prussian political film, but if anybody has a shadow of himself, it would be Barry Levinson. Speaking of which, we were talking about documentaries earlier and how that seems to be the most groundbreaking. And PBS had produced a documentary called The Boogeyman, which is all about Lee Atwater.
Yes, I saw that.
And Lee Atwater is one of these people that revolutionized the idea of getting into the muck of politics and tarring and feathering your opponent. And this is somebody that was really good at taking any little thing and blowing it up to such huge proportions and having people doubt a candidate based on the most ridiculous things. And it really goes into what he did against Michael Dukakis, especially with the infamous Willie Horton ad. Mm-hmm. And how it so contrasted to how he saw himself. He saw himself as somebody that was a paid mercenary that was doing his job. And he was a Southern guy. I think he was from, where was he from, Arkansas or South Carolina or something like that? Somewhere in the deep South, maybe Alabama. And he thought he was doing his job, that he was paid to do his job, and he was going to have his candidate win at all costs, no matter what sort of things you were putting out there. But he was also a blues musician. He played in like a half-rate blues band where
ironic.
Yeah, I mean, somebody that is looking to the lowest common denominator in terms of getting people to vote against your opponent and playing with this all-black band. And I love the documentary. I wish it would have gotten more attention, but I think when things are released on PBS, it's a very small audience you're talking to. But I'm just curious what you guys thought of the film.
Well, I thought it was fascinating that he just didn't see the damage he was doing. He thought everything was A-okay in what he was doing. But I found the ending of the documentary really telling, where he was, it's not really a spoiler because you can look this up online, but he was dying of cancer.
Yeah, brain cancer.
And he was telling everybody, pray for me, I read the Bible every day, and then after he died, they picked up his Bible and it had never been opened. So even to the end, he was always selling himself and a story, no matter what.
But I know politics has been like this for decades and decades, because you look at political cartoons, the way they were portraying like somebody like Woodrow Wilson, or there's portraying somebody like Andrew Jackson or something like that. There were still pointed political cartoons, but this was one of those guys that really made it okay to make up stuff or take it to the extreme. Like if somebody would get a paper cut, Lee Atwater would make it seem like, it was a self-inflicted knife wound, And he set the tone. It started in the 80s. It started with that 1988 election. And then look how, although they failed in the 90s with Clinton, because Clinton was such a powerful force, but how much the right-wing opponents of Clinton, and then later Gore, and then later John Kerry, and even President Obama, how much they go into the dirt, into the muck, and try and get these people to believe in things that maybe, let's put it this way, America doesn't have exactly the most intellectual of population. So there's a lot of people, and they're not necessarily all in the South either. I'm not going to say that. They're not necessarily all in the South. They're all over this country. You have pockets of ignorance all over. So they're going to look at something like that and go, because of Lee Atwater, we allow assholes today to go, well, President Obama is a Muslim, and he wasn't born in this country. Well, what proof do you have? Well, it's something I know. Well, you're an ignorant fuck. So... but Lee Atwater was the one. I mean, Kitty Dukakis, Michael Dukakis' wife, she went in for therapy to help her with depression. Talking to a psychiatrist, which you would hope you would do if you're depressed. Go talk to somebody. That's what you're supposed to do. And he says that she had shock treatment and that she was being hooked up with jumper cables. And then you had the Willie Horton ad, which was basically putting this man because of this furlough, this complicated furlough process within the state of Massachusetts that wasn't something that was easily explained in a 30-second ad, and you just show this black man's face over and over again. What does that say? And then the rotating criminals in and out.
Struck me the most, and we're talking about 1988. That revolving door thing with the prisoners coming in and out, and that very last shot has to have the black man staring right at the camera to freak out all of white America, saying, look, this guy's going to come to your neighborhood once he gets out of jail.
Very
If you vote for Dukakis.
Advise and Consent.
I've seen.
Amazing film by, what's his name, the German guy?
Otto Preminger?
Otto Preminger, yes. So he managed to make one of the all-time great political films. A DVD came out of it, became, I think, about 10 years ago.
Yeah, it was part of the controversial classics.
Yes, and wonderful film to see how the process, and that's decades before the Lee Atwater stuff went on. There was still dirty tricks going on behind the scenes, but just not involving the media so much. Anyway, check out as many political films as we talked about.
Write them down as you watch.
Advise and Consent, The Boogeyman, All the President's Men, Parallax View.
Street Fight.
Street Fight. That's a great one.
Yeah, but we've discussed it before on a previous episode.
Yeah, Street Fight. That's another great one to check out. The War Room, Fahrenheit 9/11, if you haven't seen it, because I'm sure there's some millennials who are like, "What?
What's that?"
But anyway, so once again, for our fellow cinephiles, Jeff and Andre, this is Michael, and we'll see you next time.